All right. Well, good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Daryl Owens, the Director of Communications for Beacon College and your moderator for tonight's event. We appreciate you investing some of your precious time to join us this evening to explore a complex, countercultural, literary, and social legacy. According to reference.com, during the European Enlightenment, a salon was a gathering of knowledgeable individuals where people conversed about philosophy, literature, and related subjects. The purpose of the salon was both to discuss ideas and also further a person's self-education. Tonight, we launch the Beacon Salon, a signature series of forums exploring the arts, history, science, and popular culture that invites you, the public, to join us on our journey of exploration. I would be remiss not to mention that among those on hand for tonight's conversation is Dr. George Haggerty, president of Beacon College, the first nonprofit college or university accredited to award bachelor's degrees primarily to students with learning disabilities, ADHD, and other specific learning differences. For the second consecutive year, bestcolleges.com has ranked Beacon College among the top 10 best colleges in Florida. And in its most recent ranking, College Magazine ranked Beacon the second best American college for students with disabilities in its top 10 list. While those recognitions marinate, let's meet our panelists. Jeb Brotman is a professor of humanities and division coordinator of arts and humanities at the West Campus of Valencia College. His teaching interests include film theory, criticism, film language, modernism, semiotics, mass media, popular culture, composition, creative writing, improvisational comedy, acting, and digital media. Okay. He earned a bachelor's degree in humanities from the Florida State University with an emphasis on religion and 20th century studies, and holds a master's degree in liberal studies from Rollins College. Jeb worked in a cannery in Alaska, lived in a kibbutz in Israel, and recently traveled to India. He is the co-founder of Dad's Garage Theater Company in Atlanta, Georgia, which has provided high-octane improv comedy since 1995. Earlier this month, the theater celebrated Bacon Fest with a special appearance by Mr. Footloose himself, Kevin Bacon. Now, thanks to Jeb, we've closed that circle of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon.
We're all here.
Fun fact, Jeb's superpower is that he can eat more hot sauce than is appropriate for the average human being. And his special talent involves growing facial hair. Please welcome to the panel, Jeb Brotman.
Everyone's got to have a special skill.
Dr. William Nesbitt is a professor of English and the chair of the Department of Humanities at Beacon College. He is widely written on the beats, including his essay, Echoes of the Revolution, Diane Di Prima and the Beat Generation, published in the literary journal Beatdom 17, and a critique of Gary Snyder's This Present Moment, published in the national online journal Route 7 Review. And his commentary on the beats was featured last year on NPR's The Academic Minute. He has been quoted recently on pop culture subjects by Variety and the Christian Science Monitor, while his op-eds on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Bob Dylan have appeared in the Orlando Sentinel and the Philadelphia Inquirer. William earned his PhD in English at Florida State University. In addition to the beats, the pop culture force is strong in this one. Among the courses he teaches are the mythic tradition in Star Wars, the graphic novel as literature, and mythology and magic. William served as the panel chair for Cyborg's Human and Posthumans at Florida State University's 33rd Annual International Film and Literature Conference. Please welcome to the panel, Dr. William Nesbitt. Dr. Maurice J. O'Sullivan, the Kenneth Curry Professor of English at Rollins College, is an award-winning teacher, scholar, columnist, and filmmaker. The former president of the faculty, chair of humanities, and the chair of the English department at Rollins, he has published a dozen books and over 100 articles, essays, and columns on literature, Florida, popular culture, Shakespeare, religion, Irish culture, education, and current events. During his career, he has received numerous grants and awards, including 2 silver medals in the Council for the Advancement and Support of Education's National Professor of the Year competition. That's a mouthful. 4 teaching awards at Rollins, 3 awards from the Florida Historical Society for his writing and films, and the Florida Magazine Association 2015 Charlie Award as Columnist of the Year. He is also publisher of Angel Alley Press and director of the Florida Center for Shakespeare Studies. Maurice, his friends call him Saki, also is the owner of an impressive kaleidoscope collection, about 200 at last count. And if that wasn't enough, he is senior partner in Nashville Pubs and in the company that brews Music City Light, which means we all know who the drinks are on after this forum. Please welcome to the panel, Dr. Maurice J. O'Sullivan. And last but not least, J. Patrick Rader is a faculty member at Lake Sumter State College. He graduated with an associate's degree in physical therapy from the University of Florida and earned his master's degree in English and creative writing from the University of Central Florida. Outside of the classroom, Patrick for about 15 years has worn zebra stripes, umpiring amateur and semi-pro baseball. And Dr. Nesbitt will appreciate this because Patrick, while driving a motorcycle, was hit by a truck in 1999. He's part cyborg. His right arm and leg are titanium. He will be back to answering some intriguing questions about the beats in just a few moments. Please welcome to the panel, Patrick Rader. With so much ground to cover this evening, I'll cut short the preamble for tonight's forum. I'll just say this. Encyclopedia Britannica says of the Beat Generation, or the Beat Movement, as an, quote, American social and literary movement originated in the 1950s, it was generally apolitical and indifferent to social problems. Its writers advocated personal release, purification, and illumination through the heightened sensory awareness that might be induced by drugs, jazz, sex, or the disciples of Zen Buddhism. A 2012 article in the Quarterly International Socialism described the Beat Generation as, quote, an artistic reaction against the infamous and military-industrial complex. Everything they did, from their free associative poetry to their spontaneous prose to their deliberately obscene provocations, I can't say that word, whether overtly political or not, was a subversion, not just of post-war conservative ideology, but also of commonplace reformist notions. The Beats embodied a critique of and a potential solution to the problems of their society. Meanwhile, Carter Manis, in his piece, The Beat Generation Starter Kit, called the Beats, quote, the nirvana of their generation, individualistic, drug-addled, and unfortunately sometimes held responsible for the Nickelbacks created in their wake. Man, those who know Nickelback know what I'm talking about. And then there's Amiri Baraka, a celebrated poet in his own right, and one of the distant satellites in the Beat galaxy, who put it this way, quote, the so-called Beat Generation was a whole bunch of people of all different nationalities who came to the conclusion that society sucked, unquote. The truth about the Beats probably lies somewhere in between. Perhaps we'll divine that truth tonight as we explore the Beats radical, rebellious, relevant? You will hear from the panelists, but we want to hear from your perspectives and hear your questions as well. At this table over here, you'll see my colleague Samantha Resnick. She has some index cards and some pens. You can trot over there as you like, write down a question, and she will bring it to me, and we will work that in this evening. Please respect the clock if we actually do pass the microphone out in the audience. We'll see how that works. All right, as a reminder, the beats use language and imagery that stretch the limits, and some material this evening may tread into those rated R zones. You've been warned. Okay, let's get to it. I'm going to start this question with the home team, Dr. Nesbitt. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William S. Burroughs are generally thought of as the big three beat writers. What three authors should form the second big three?
All right, let's see. We're getting sound out of here?
Yeah.
Okay. I would probably say, in addition to them, Diane de Prima is a really, really important one. I would definitely put her down there. Maybe Amiri Baraka, because one of the things about him is that he was writing for it's about 50 years, and he spanned a lot of different conventions and themes and sort of phases in his writing. And for the third, I would say maybe Neil Cassidy, because even though his written output isn't substantial, he was very, very influential to a lot of the key beats, especially Kerouac and Ginsberg. And without him, you wouldn't, I think, have had the other ones. So that would probably be my three.
Any other comments from the panel?
If I may, I definitely think I'm okay without that. I think you have to. When I was revisiting the beat poets and their poetry, I forgot how much I liked Corso, and I came across for those of you who may not see, we come prepared. And interestingly enough, you can pick this up. This is the Outlaw Bible of American Poetry, so I think it's a tremendous place to find these. But I definitely Lee Corso, is that the name I'm thinking of? Gregory Corso, yes. Real young, was the youngest of them all. Ginsberg called him the awakener of the youth. And somebody else I know referred to him as an urchin Shelley. And so I like he was the youngest out of all of those, correct? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I really thought that he definitely needed to would be one of my fourth or fifth. And then Harold Norse. I mean, he was so close to Ginsberg, and I really thought that a lot of the beat poets and stuff, a lot of theirs was reactionary, as we've said. And so I thought Norse's reactions to just William Carlos Williams, who might even be considered one of the early beats. But I just thought the fact that he had this ongoing dialogue, whether it was real or just in his head, with William Carlos, or just in his work with William Carlos Williams, I thought you have to throw him in there too, if not because of his proximity to Ginsberg.
And I mean, I'd like to throw out Baraka, who was known in those days as Leroy Jones. And I can tell you some stories about having a drink with him back when I was young on that.
Do tell.
And Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who is just, to me, an extraordinary poet and was part of it, and a person who was around then, who has continued writing poetry and who just received the Nobel Prize for Literature, Bob Dylan. You know, he certainly would fit into that mold, especially in refusing to go to accept, to give a speech, which is so beat, right? That is so beat.
All right. Well, I guess we'll move on to the next question. While it is debated whether the beat movement had a precise timeline, many cap the beat movement at about a decade. Did the beat's ideals doom their output to a relatively short stale date? And we'll go to you, Jed, on this one.
Okay. and I guess I'll give a sort of timeline of how I got into the Beats. Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Anybody read that one? That's Tom Wolfe. From Tom Wolfe, then into Ken Kesey, and then so on. Interesting. I do think there is a specific time window where the Beats made sense. Not unlike Holden Caulfield makes sense when you're 15 and everybody's phony. Not unlike Nick Carraway from Gatsby, and when you're 30 and you're old. So, in other words, there's a window where this rebelliousness and this sort of masturbatory, drug-taking, fun-loving, no responsibility level is important in the growth of anybody, and particularly the American landscape said, eat me alive. I mean, I'm open, with the opening of the interstate highway system and a combination of things. It was perfect for people to say, let's go, baby, right? I mean, it was one of those scenarios. I do think it closed, though, that window, probably after a certain amount of Madison Avenue co-opting of ideals, and then ultimately people, gaining force and the advent of more television, more media, more everything. They didn't need that beat sound, that beat rebelliousness. In other words, it became watered down. And the beats themselves, I think, lost a sense of that gravitas or that power, that potency, because others picked up on it. That doesn't mean that they didn't have their own special sort of time frame, and I do think it is a time frame. But if you're looking now, like who are the beats now, and I can find it. I wrote down, for the kids out there, who would be a beat today, right? And to beat Chance the Rapper, okay? Chance the Rapper is a beat. If you, for those of you who are not so familiar with Chance the Rapper, Chance the Rapper did not sign with any record company, did not sign with any agency, so to speak. Did all of his stuff on his own through his own media, created his own material. He is his own entity. In other words, and then yet wins awards on this. So he's somebody. Edward Snowden, love him or hate him, would be a beat. Whole Foods might be a beat. Bernie Sanders might be beat. Legalized recreational marijuana is beat. Vice News, Twitter, podcasts, Occupy, Jim Jarmusch, Milo Yiannopoulos, don't want to say that out loud, and maybe even Lana Del Rey. These are people who represent a current scope of beat, but could never be Kerouac, Ginsberg, and sort of, the like. I think because there's just no way. That window is closed. I know it took a long time talking, sorry.
I'm agree with you. I definitely think it was a chronological or maybe a sociological or socio-cultural window, if you will. I think also it was a geographic intellectual window, that
Sure.
these were people that were, from a certain area, a
Yep.
certain geography, if you will. And that I think these satellite characters that you talk about and that we mentioned, the Barakas and certainly the Hunter S. Thompsons, those people that were on the fringe. And I almost would see the beat movement as the intellectual movement that once it became populist, it was the hippies.
Sure.
And the politics of the 60s
Yes.
changed
Yes.
everything.
Yeah.
I mean, I always think of it as ending around 58.
Yeah.
And then from that time on, society began changing. I mean, we all wanted to be the Beats. And they were still there, and they were still writing, and they were still doing extraordinary work. But things changed radically, and with Kennedy's election, with the war, with the development of a new generation, there was a major transformation.
I mean, I'll give you an example. I read it when I was 19, and it took me to Alaska to work in a cannery. When I say that, I was like, I'm out of here,
Right.
And it was important. It spoke to my 19-year-old anger, wanderlust, sort of, I'm fed up with all this BS. I'm not okay with this anymore. And what do I do? Go as far away as I can, right? I mean, but still speak English. I mean, I didn't know, right? Very beat onto itself, and yet sort of combination, the precursor of that being like a, this John Steinbeck sort of character, a cannery row of sorts, and trying to let's work with my hands. to make the money to go there, I worked down the road in Apopka, Green Acres Nursery with Mexicans planting flowers for the summer, and that destroyed me. And I was like, okay, what else could I do that's worse than that? You know, be a Slimer in a cannery. You know, when you're late, for my young people, when you're late at the cannery, you get the job of blood flow command, where you are in charge of making sure the machine doesn't get too bloody, and you're hosing this machine down and pushing blood into a ditch into the floor. And I thought to myself, wow, thank you, Jack Kerouac. Thank you, Jack Kerouac. I appreciate how I got here.
I would liken that to my days as a kennel technician in charge of animal maintenance and dietary control.
Yes.
Which was, and I think that the Beats and the Merry Pranksters allowed people like myself and yourself to give those really horrible, shitty, literally
Yes,
shitty
literally,
jobs
yes.
such great titles.
Yeah. Mine wasn't so great. I was a Slimer. That was, I thought, is there a better title for this? Like fish cutter? You know? No, sir, you're a Slimer.
You know, I'm feeling this brotherhood growing because I'm thinking about some of the worst jobs I've had, and it was cleaning grease buckets at Wendy's in the summertime.
Yes.
That was pretty bad. But before this gets out of control, Patrick raised an interesting question, I think. Let's go back to it for a moment. Are the Beats truly a movement? I mean, is there a difference between a coherent movement and a bunch of people who are loosely affiliated by geography, life circumstance, and friendship? That's a toss-up. Anybody wants to start?
I mean, Ginsberg himself kind of said no, that he thought that in some ways it was just kind of a niche or a label that had been given to them that made it easier to market and to sell them. And other people have argued that really, if you look at the Beats, what they have in common is that Allen Ginsberg is kind of at the social center, which helps to explain why certain people that we might think of as Beat aren't considered Beat because they didn't really know Ginsberg at the time. But at the same time, I still think that there's something there. And kind of think a little bit back to the previous question, you know, I think that the real popularity of the Beats was in the late 50s and in the 60s. But I think just because it's not necessarily, you know, trendy or fashionable or fad, doesn't mean it's still not important and relevant. You know, I'm teaching beat literature this semester, and when I sit in there with the students, you know, they're like 18, 19, 20, and we read Howl for the first time, or we talk about Baraka's Somebody Blew Up America, I see that resonating, and I see them thinking about it, and I don't know that for them it's all that different than it was for students of their age 50 years ago. And I know for me, my relationship to the work changes as I get older, but I still have that relationship. I had a student many years ago who, while trying to explain why he liked Howl so much, said that when you read Howl, you know where you are. And I think there's truth to that, you know. And I think that, you know, when I sort of read it, it helps kind of position me and tell me kind of where I'm at.
If I could, it seemed to me that it was more of a culture than a movement. And I'll go back and tell you the story. When I was in high school, as a junior, my friends and I, if we weren't playing basketball after class, we'd go over to the village. I lived in Jersey City, and it was a 12-minute ride from on the path, the subway over to the village. We'd go over there on McDougal Street, the Cafe Wa, I was trying to remember them, the Gaslight Cafe, lots of little coffee places, and best of all, McSorley's Old Ale House. And what was remarkable is how many of the Beats used to hang out at McSorley's. They never admit it. It's not part of their history because it was seen as too Irish, too establishment with a certain group. But we would go there from a Jesuit prep school, and we were naturally as pretentious as all high school students. So we would get into a cafe and we would start speaking in Latin, which is, you know, what Jesuit kids do. And we'd start speaking. And then usually if we didn't get enough attention, we'd start chanting Greek lines from Homer, from the Iliad or the Odyssey. And we all had to memorize them back when people memorized things. And the person I got to know the best was Leroy Jones. Because my nickname, and Darryl mentioned Saki, that's my nickname's nickname. My real nickname is Socrates. And Baraka, I call him Baraka now. Baraka loved whenever he saw me standing up and saying Socrates. And then he would come over and we'd have a drink and we'd talk. He was a small man, incredibly articulate. It was clear he wanted a better education. He was very aspirational. And I had read his preface to a 20-volume suicide note, still one of the most extraordinary works I've ever read. And the same way that On the Road affected so many other people, that affected me because it spoke to the kind of questions that Catholic kids had, and it spoke so beautifully to them. And when he found out I had actually read some of his poetry, he was happy. He introduced us to a number of people. Lucien Carr, I remember meeting once, who was one of the outliers on it. Diane DePrima came through. Gregory Corso was there. And much later I met and spent some time with Ginsberg when I was at Ohio State. And he was, just a massive figure. I mean, he was, to me, the charismatic, intellectual, extraordinary figure. I never thought of Jones Baraka in quite that way. But it was, and I've always told my students this story, and of course they all look at me, sure you did. And so about, was it 8 years ago, Susie? We went to New York, we were down at a jazz club in the Village, and the band leader said one of my closest friends is up at the bar, Mamu Baraka. And so Susie looked at me as a challenge, so I got up and walked up, and it was one of my wondrous moments when he lied and said he remembered me. And I thought that was great on it. And I did talk to him briefly about the poem, which made New Jersey take away his position as poet laureate of New Jersey, because he was questioning the World Trade Center issue. And he was unapologetic about it, but he was really just an extraordinarily nice man when you got to deal with him. His son, by the way, some of you may know, is Raz Baraka, the mayor of Newark. And he is a rapper, too. Not quite like Chance, but he's a rapper.
Fun fact, I attended Howard University with Raz Baraka, and he actually maintained some of the militant, rebellious tendencies of his dad when we took over the administration building back in 19... I'm still on the run from that, but anyway, we'll move on to Mr. Burroughs. Burroughs' novels are classified among American postmodernism, and he was also considered among the titans of the Beat movement. What literary characteristics does Burroughs share with each literary movement? And I'll start that one off with Pat.
I've thought about this particular writer specifically, and I've been revisiting my Burroughs recently via Netflix, and I'm teaching Neil Gaiman American Gods in one of my literature courses, and so of course that's been leading us down some roads, and I don't think you can read modern American horror without talking about Cronenberg, which then leads us to Burroughs. And I believe that really, in my opinion, the only thing that makes Burroughs beat is timing. And geography, again, like I said, I don't find his work particularly beat. As far as when I look at poetics, meter, rhythm, maybe content, maybe source material, certainly characters. I think the general lack of optimism in Burroughs' work, and is really. I think the Beats, if nothing else, had a modicum of optimism, that they still held some hope, and I think Burroughs threw the bathwater out with the baby, and then shot his wife for it. So, I wouldn't qualify Burroughs as beat at all, to be honest with you.
Dr. Nisbet?
Well, I think one of the things that Burroughs has in keeping with postmodernism is definitely narrative experimentation. His early work, he'd really gotten into something called the cut-ups, which literally meant like taking text, film, even music, cutting it up, rearranging it, and then sort of seeing what was there. So a lot of it is kind of non-linear, disheveled, a bit, and so forth. And he was definitely geographically situated with the Beats, and knew them and hung out with them, and had romantic affairs with some of them and such as that. So some of those things qualify him as Beat. On the one hand, I want to say that because what he was doing was so radically different, that also sort of makes him Beat. But then the problem is it's sort of such an abstract kind of qualifier at the same time. So I guess maybe what I would say kind of qualifies him as Beat is that he was really pushing against structure. He was pushing against traditional narrative structures. He was pushing against just sort of the structures of politics and culture, and really questioning and seeking, doing it in a different way in some ways in his writing. But maybe that's the commonality that I would see among him and the other Beats.
Yeah, I might put him in category E, none of these. In this postmodern light, I mean, postmodern in the world of, let's say, plurality, multiple facets and multiple things, and his experience living a lot of time overseas is also another sort of interesting facet that is brought back to the Beats. And so in some ways he does fit in that mold, and yet he is, and then yet at the end of his career, sort of, teaming up with Nike and other people and sort of selling his persona of sorts felt disheartening, and yet maybe he was like, well, make some money. I mean, he was just like, why not? And that alone could be his sort of tongue-in-cheek play on the whole bit to say, yeah, Nike, what that even means. Meaning, maybe he was trying to address something else. As far as, and I'm always going back to Naked Lunch, I mean, addressing also kind of a sexual revolution of sorts. Okay, not only drugs involved, because oftentimes he's seen with that, but the freedom of, and this goes to Ginsberg too, but the world of the underground S&M / Lou Reed, Velvet Underground kind of universe that lived within that space is an interesting notion that, again, you could say that's not so Beat, and yet ultimately that's very Beat. That's completely Beat. All of this says punk rock. All of this says I'm not doing what you want me to do. Matter of fact, I'm not even thinking about it. I'm just
that
doing
fluidity of sexuality, if you will.
Yeah,
I like that.
Just doing what I'm doing. And that's uncomfortable at times, and yet, now, today, we're much more comfortable with it, but in 19-something, that was not okay. And I say that, throughout, even today, it's still not okay, but it's much more okay now.
All right. I want to remind the audience that we'd love to hear from you, so if you have questions, my colleague is sitting there lonely, waiting for you to walk over. All right, we'll move on. Jazz and the Beats were almost inseparable. It's fair to say, is it fair to say, that music improvisation, the syncopated rhythms of jazz influence the anti-canonical literary expression of the Beats? And I think I'll start with Saki this time.
I think obviously, plus that connection geographically, physically, as Patrick was talking about, where they were at the heart of, at that time, American jazz, which was in the Village. And we know jazz was in the South and doing wonderful things, but the kind of jazz that people were listening to was often coming out of that. The number of venues that existed in the Village for people to play, and on the road, they're constantly going back to jazz clubs, going into jazz clubs, trying to recreate that sound. I think it would probably be like some of our contemporary poets trying to pick up the rhythms of rap. There's a fellow, John Slim, in South Florida, who's writes Haitian-inspired poetry, and he's always picking up some wonderful rhythms, bringing Creole in with his English, and it's an awful lot of fun. And I think that was that combination, plus the jazz lifestyle. And you're not starting till late. You're staying up late. There's an awful lot of, in those days, it was called weed around. There was a lot of alcohol around. There are a lot of women around. And I think later you're going to get to the role of women with the Beats. And that certainly appealed to the Beats. The other thing about the clubs is they were cheap. You could go to one of them and nurse a drink all night long. And the Beats did not have much money. And I think that's another element that ended the movement. Once the Beats began having access to money, once money entered into it, money just changed. I'm not sure if it's fair to say corrupted, it changed everything. I mean, the writers today make so much money, the cost of bringing writers in. You know, when we brought Allen Ginsberg into Ohio State, we were holding an election. The president had retired, and the governor was going to appoint someone. And this was after Kent State, so we decided, of course, we had to hold an election. And we got Woody Hayes, the coach, to support us. Good. He didn't understand what was happening. It was great. And he would come and he would sit in the meetings, and he actually thought we were going to have an election that the governor was going to accept. And we brought Ginsberg in to do a fundraiser for a weekend. He refused to accept money. He refused to stay in a hotel. He had to stay in one of the houses of one of the faculty members sponsoring it. And he actually refused to leave. He just stayed. We expected him to be there for 48 hours. And then the next week, we were all, we were young teachers. And we were all trying to figure out, what do we do with him? What do we do with him? And of course, he wanted to go to places where there were cute young boys. And so we figured out where the cute young guys, where the cute young graduate students, and we took him there. And he was just happy.
Okay. Any other comment on that particular question?
Well, I'm going to make a quick comment as I did some professional improv for years at my theater. And the way improv works here's the secret. Okay. No, the way improv really works, long form and even short form improv, is to say yes to things. In other words, scenes progress and move forward by saying yes. And if you listen to jazz and if you listen to the Beats overall, they're saying yes to things, moving forward. Okay, and when I say that, they get themselves in trouble by saying yes. If I say to all of us, "All right, guys, let's all take off our clothes," and you're like, "Wait, what? I don't want to do that." But if you're the Beat, you're gonna say, "Clothes off," right? "All right, let's go outside. Let's go down to Sip down the street." "Yes, let's." So we've left the room. We're naked. We're at the bar. Okay, where the average human is gonna say, "No, I kind of like my clothes. I'm not comfortable, and I don't need to go to the bar." And, we haven't done anything. But the Beats are gonna force this jazz idea of saying yes. I'm thinking of Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, that first track, So What? They come in, and it's kind of a play on, hey, who wants to play? Who wants to lead? Do-do-do-do. And it's kind of like, oh, I want to play. And then who's going to lead? Oh, I'll lead. And it's this interplay of, okay, I'm not going to stop playing because you're with me. I'm going to say yes to the next beat. Not, well, pun intended, but not pun intended, to the next move. And there's definitely the sound of jazz in so much of the work. Particularly, I would lean on Kerouac for a lot of that. I mean, openly saying, this sound is where he cranked off these pieces, oftentimes, 3 days? Subterraneans was like 3 days or something to that effect. Whatever it was super short, like, what? How did that happen? And I think it happened because he just didn't stop himself. Good, bad, indifferent. That's how he actually ends up dying, not stopping himself, saying yes to, okay, you want more? No, yes, I do. He never was able to turn anything really off, sadly. But to go back to the original question of jazz, certainly there's the sound, and I feel that way throughout most of the beat work.
And remember, they're typing this on manual typewriters.
Yeah.
And those of us old enough,
my goodness.
I don't know if any of you have used a manual typewriter. Those of us who use those, usually you tried to create a rhythm with it when you were typing. There was a sound that
yeah.
we've entirely lost with
You're right.
newer technology. And they were just great. I remember just sitting there and clacking, and they just,
Somebody, I think they said that Kerouac could pull off 120 words a minute.
Yeah.
That was his sort of
Yeah.
like,
Well,
known for that, which is crazy.
They even talk about my favorite writer, Hunter S. Thompson, who was a bastard son of the Beats, if you will. He talks about how, and I think even Coursman Kerouac talks about how they would just read Salinger and just type other people's work to get their rhythm.
Wow.
And I even found during my long-term rehabilitation, I was learning how to write again and use my right arm again. And so I would practice on an old typewriter or just on a non-plugged-in keyboard just to get those rhythms back and to get into back to those rhythms. And so I think that relationship to music, and that's even without mentioning the fact that the Harlem Renaissance, when a lot of these people who became the Beats were probably young kids, they were kicking around in these neighborhoods where Charlie Parker and Sonny Liston and these guys were playing incredible music. And then, of course, that segues you into the whole Harlem, Havana, Haiti diaspora, and which you mentioned earlier. And then you talked about the young poet in South Florida, right? And how he's inflecting hip hop rhythms and meter into his work. And so, I mean, you can't help but see how it's all connected, and it all comes back to Florida. And the Beats should be grateful that we are here. They don't even realize how instrumental we were in their formation.
Well, we have an audience question. One of our audience members asked, who would be in the Beats in the 1960s? So I guess the question is, were there some other faces who emerged in the 60s with some tangential relationship to the Beats? You've stumped me.
Yeah, right.
Take it.
Well, I mean, are we talking about in addition to Ginsberg and Kerouac and Burroughs at
That's
that
what
point?
Yeah,
my
yeah,
guess is.
I
yeah.
guess, let's see, Baraka's emerging. You've got Corso. Let's think, who else? I think, see, I guess some of it is you have a number of figures, but they're not necessarily recognized then. Because you've got people like Peter Orlovsky, who was Ginsberg's longtime lover, who put out a couple of books. So, I know there was one in the early 70s. He may have put something out in the 60s. But I think it wasn't until later that sort of as Ginsberg's fame kind of grew and magnified, people became more interested in some of the people around him. You have people like Joyce Johnson, who's writing and writing about some of her times with Kerouac at that point in time. Even Hetty Jones, Leroy Jones's wife at the time, is writing, and a lot of them, Edie Parker, Kerouac's ex, who are writing but aren't necessarily getting the same sort of level of attention. But later on, as some of those people sort of faded out and died, and the canon kind of opened up some, people sort of went back and took new interest in some of those writings. So I guess I would sort of argue that I think in terms of what people are looking at and reading in the 60s with the Beats, I don't know if it was that different from the 50s, but there was a lot of great stuff being produced that wouldn't get recognition until the 90s really, and probably even beyond that.
Would you say that the Merry Pranksters, Kesey and that bunch, would you qualify them as Beats, or would they the natural evolution, or I mean, I would argue that Kesey might even if
I think there's definitely overlap. I think you could argue it as a progression, succession, evolution. That it's beat, but not beat. That some of it is that for us, we were talking about with the Beats, jazz music was the big thing. For the hippies and the hipsters, it became rock music. That in some ways the Beats, it was a little more, I don't know, sort of introverted in some ways, but the hippies, it was more sort of extroverted. You go from sort of the stereotype of black clothing and berets to tie-dye and rainbow swirls and so forth. But there's still that restless sort of exploration and seeking. And if you think about like electric cooled acid test that Tom Wolfe did in 1968, which is talking about a bunch of hippies getting together and kind of driving around in this big painted bus around the nation, you've got Neil Cassidy, who's the one driving it. Yeah, who was really big with Kerouac and so on. So I sort of think of it as kind of a Venn diagram. There's some things that are different, but there's definitely an overlap in connection with the beats.
And I might argue, sort of, I guess, tangentially, what artists are taking the beat idea and making it their own. I happen to miss him today, Brian Wilson, Pet Sounds, right? Which is a sort of watershed album of saying, well, I'm just doing this album for me. It's my pet sound. Which is very beat onto itself, where it's like, I'm not doing this a commercial piece. I'm doing the greatest album that sort of ever was. And why are you doing it? Because I'm in love with you, which is like also, what? Who are you, Brian? That's a dangerous statement to make. I mean, he was not understood, probably even by himself during that time period. So it was an interesting, and he's an interesting character to go there. It wasn't expected for a seemingly boy band to make that album and then have it be so artistically recognized. Now he wanted it to be, or he was seeking that, and that's it. The word seeker. I mean, he's trying to be a seeker of sorts. So I think there are a lot of other '60s characters that join forces with, or are allowed to do what they do because the Beats, sort of smash that wall down and say, look, we've already done whatever you think you've done. We've done a lot of it. We're still doing it now. Keep going, or start something new. And so I do think, to the person who asked about the '60s, you could probably point to about maybe 15 different characters, musicians to artists to, who knows, even athletes, women athletes and other people who are battling and making waves in that world.
And one of the truly remarkable things about the Beats to me is the number of truly gifted writers who emerge from it. I'm not sure how many folks you include when you do your courses, but the last time I taught a course, I think I had 20 people that the students were reading, at least to some extent. And I don't see that. I think you're absolutely right. They smashed that wall down. People went through it. But I don't see emerging from that in literature.
Yeah, maybe
anything
not.
like that. It happened probably in music. I'd also add Jerry Garcia into that.
Sure.
And film, of course, was also emerging as an extraordinarily important medium. When you were, if you notice, I was very quiet about Burroughs because I really can't get into him since I think there were filmmakers at the time. Andy Warhol was doing things that I thought were a lot more interesting, and they were over faster than trying to read one of Burroughs' books. For me.
This is true.
All right. In many ways, Walt Whitman can be seen as the spiritual godfather of the Beats. He embraced free verse, and his seminal free verse work, Leaves of Grass, was tarred as obscene by many for its overt sexuality. Which Beat authors explicitly harken back to Whitman? And we'll go back to Patrick on this one.
I think I've talked about this with everybody at some point in the evening before we got started. Was that certainly? I mean, Ginsberg's Howl. I printed out and was reading it, obviously, in preparing over this for the last couple of days, and I couldn't help. I'm seeing hints of pioneers in Ginsberg's Howl. And just in the language and its questioning and its call back and forth, it's almost elegiac call to the audience, and then the next line I would almost expect to be a response from the audience. And you see that in Whitman, and I definitely see that in Howl. I felt Norse was playful in that respect, and certainly in his bond with William Carlos Williams, who I see as definitely a Whitman knockoff. With their natural ties, and that all harkens back to Thoreau, who set the table for all of them.
Sure. Yeah.
Who set the table for all of them, I believe, and it was always that existentialist is what there's got to be more than just this. And I think the Beats were the first to say, there's got to be more than, it's more than just the sex, it's more than just the getting drunk, it's more than just the alcohol, it is the howl, it is the acts while you're doing these things. It's not just that you've been under these influences of mysticism or chemistry, but that you've had these experiences, and now that you're just going, it's beyond that. There's that existential, I've risen above, beyond just that mere experience. And so it's not just a recreation, if you will. And I think that's the Whitman-esque tendency, and I think that's certainly how in its form and it just its very, very structure is a callback to Whitman's work. And I even have a note to myself, Thomas as well. So I don't know if I answered that question at all, but
Follow-ups from the panel?
No, I'm gonna agree. I mean, 100% with Whitman being this precursor, and again Thoreau is what I talk about today. I took my students outside and I made them sit for 15 minutes. And I said, "Don't say anything. Put your phones away. Separate, like little children. Just sit here. And what are we doing? In the shade. Sit. Just sit quietly. Are we in trouble? No, you're not in trouble. You're gonna be in trouble if you don't sit still." This sense of getting in touch, actually doing things, the sort of pragmatic, the empirical, getting out there and doing it, and actually then moving forward along that route of being something, and the existentialist idea. Don't talk about it, or don't even just write so much about it, but then go ahead and experience it. Be that. And it does give other writers later on that impetus to go to India, Ginsberg, and others to keep traveling further, literally, as opposed to somewhere in your mind. They bring that to us, but there is that sense of getting in touch with nature, getting in touch with things, whatever those things might be, good, bad, and different again.
let me posit this question to my peers here. I had this conversation in the car up here, and we see when we talk about movements or organizations or peoples in general, there's always a point where that group to be accepted by the society as a whole, right? And I even likened it back to my own MFA thesis defense, is that before I could break the rules of English in writing nonfiction, I had to show my committee members from the first half of my thesis that I knew the rules of writing nonfiction. And so certainly the earliest works of these poets, you know, and these writers, we say they almost have to be respectful and mindful, if not homage, to these original greats, these canonized writers like the Whitmans and the Thoreaus, to get that level of respectability by the establishment, you know, by the colleges where they're attending and by the professors that they're teaching. They have to get their respect first before they can get crazy and wacky, right? And so obviously, especially when you're talking about doing drugs and having homosexual acts, my gosh, the establishment at that time didn't even mention those things, not even in whispered conversations.
Right.
And so now he's screaming them at the top of his lungs, but yet his form and his structure is so respectful of Whitman. Granted, all these penises are a little bit much, but you know, I've got to say the rhyming structure is phenomenal. And so you almost, Frederick Douglass had to do it 100 years earlier so that black writers could be respected. You know, women had to do it so women. I mean, so it's almost like that in retrospect, they all have to. You got to play by the rules before you can break them, and I think we see that as, all right, MFers, here are the rules. Now, and especially in Ginsberg case, here's my penis. You know?
And I think that's the interesting thing. You can see a lot of early beat work that kind of is conventional. You know, if you look at a lot of Ginsberg's poetry, he's following the Romantics and churning out this, sort of safe, conventional poetry. If you look at Kerouac, his first book wasn't On the Road. His first book was a Thomas Wolfe knockoff that didn't really do a whole lot. Even Burroughs in some ways. You look at like Junkie, which is a fairly kind of, even it's talking about, junkies in terms of the subject matter, but in terms of the writing, it's a fairly conventional work. And I think what happened for a lot of them is they did that writing and thought, I don't know, I'm not really into this. Nobody else seems to be either. And then in my own life, I'm trying to do conventional things. Burroughs had you'll appreciate this, Dr. Haggard. He had a bachelor's in psychology from Harvard. Gary Snyder, anthropology from UCLA. Ginsberg had graduated from Columbia. They did what they were supposed to do. Some of them even tried working kind of straight jobs for a while, and just like, this isn't fulfilling. I've got to do, something different. And then, so I think that then there's that break, and they become sort of the beats that we know. But there were sort of those early years that were sort of uninteresting and produced a lot of uninteresting kind of writing. But I think they did put their time in showing that they knew the rules.
Right. I mean, you've got to
say,
follow
but it
your
doesn't
dogma
work.
first for a little while, right? You got to know you're a lousy dentist before you realize I shouldn't be a dentist.
Right.
Exactly. And there may be an even clearer image in the artists of the early 20th century. If you go to the wonderful Dali Museum in St. Pete. I mean, his early stuff is really conventional before those clocks start
Yeah.
getting liquid.
Yeah.
And Picasso, you look at some of his earliest work, and once they had done that, probably the same point, that they just thought, that's not enough. We need to kill this stuff and move on into some other newer reality mode.
I would even venture to say that each of us in our own personal artistic experiences has certainly started off as a derivative or a knockoff. I mean, most certain, like I said, I lived the '90s trying to emulate Hunter S. Thompson's lifestyle, and it wasn't until I got older that I could appreciate his work and his actual writing. And it wasn't until after my motorcycle accident and I was being rebuilt that I realized I should not try to live like Hunter S. Thompson.
And we also, and most of you do not seem to be approaching me in age, we also have to remember how incredibly dull the post-war period was. I mean, and that's exactly what all those kids who had gone to Europe and fought World War II wanted. They wanted a dull world. They wanted, Eisenhower. They wanted suburbia. They wanted to get their educations. They did not want anything more. And I have to believe many of these writers wanted to break that mold, break that pattern. I know when we were leaving St. Peter's Prep in the afternoon, taking off our ties, realizing we had to wear our jackets, and going over to the village, we didn't want the kind of conventional lives that our parents wanted, although we knew the next morning. And we put your ties back on and going back to prep.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that discussion. In today's society, the beat's midnight blue profanity might seem like white noise, but in their era, it was jarringly shocking. Was that the point? Or did the cussing act as a literary device? Or was it camouflage for deficient prose? And that's a toss-up.
Deficient. He's a craftsman of words, right?
What was the fucking question? Sorry.
Somebody get a bar of soap for this guy.
Oh,
That
softball.
was easy. It's too easy. It's too easy. Actually, I think the answer is answer D, all the above. I mean, there's a little bit of all of that within it. Lenny Bruce is sort of, somebody who's in that ilk and that's, going there. I mean, later on, George Carlin, others are opening that door of normalizing linguistic code switching and the like. And I would say, there was shock value, but it was also, it became part of what they really were dealing with. If they're in the jazz clubs, if they're in that world themselves, they're not undoing their own code, right? I mean, they're exposing their code, or the code switch is available for you to check out. I do think sometimes it's weak. There were some weak literary choices. If you look back at well, really, that's all you could say? F this and look at her blank blank with, whatever it might be. So we can look back in time and say, oh, but maybe at that time it was more dangerous, and maybe it was a rebellious statement of sorts. But long term, in a larger view, mountaintop to valley, we can see, really, that's all you had to say about that? I mean, it could have been deeper. But at the time, again, this window, it felt the strongest word that could be said, or the word that was definitely potentially dangerous, or as you mentioned, I think blue language, whatever you want to call it. So I do think it had a sense of import for its time. I mean, unfortunately now you can put on some 3-6 Mafia and they're an award-winning band, Grammy-winning, and listen to the first track and like, whoa, what happened? Where is language?
But yet at the same time, I think we've been fortunate enough that because they set the table, that we all enjoy a level of academic freedom.
Sure.
There are some high school students that I know who say that in high school, the high school teachers talk about politics. They say, I'm just not going to talk about politics. But when they get to college, they go to college classes, and their college instructors say, we'll talk about politics. Drop fucking socks. And that, I think, is a direct result of their language. I mean, you're talking about, these were, as we have all said, they're intellectuals coming from an intellectual culture, and so they almost gave a pass so that when some trailer park poet from Lake County drops an F-bomb, I've got a little more street cred now. Because that other highfalutin word may not have occurred to me because I went to Eustis High School and not Columbia. You know, I went to Lake Sumter State, college. And so I think that for those of us that maybe are a little more simple and maybe are just naturally a little more blue, it gave us some credibility, if you will.
And in one instance, it wasn't only the language. When I was in college, I went back to see Baraka's Dutchman, which was performed off Broadway. I suspect most people have not seen that
No.
play. It's an extraordinary play. I think it's one of the great American plays. I am in a minority on that issue. But it's a short two-scene play set on a subway in which a young black man looking as distinguished and well-dressed as Darryl is sitting there, and a slutty white girl gets on and teases him, and she's trying to break him out of his shell. And at the end of the play, he explodes because she's throwing epithets at him. She's using language. Other people have gotten onto the subway car. And this is 1964, and she's standing, provoking him, and he finally stands up. And at the climactic moment of the play, he slaps her. Now, you have to think of a black man slapping a white woman in 1964, even in New York City.
Right.
The audience gasped. I mean, it was the most exhilarating and frightening moment I'd ever seen. I thought some of the audience might do something on it. But that willingness to take those risks, and he uses the language, the blue language, but he moves way beyond that, which is part of what impressed me about it. And when we think back to what the Beats did, it's not those words that we remember. I mean, they're in there, but that's not the essence of it. That's not the heart of it. And that's the problem I have with writing students. They think that's the point. You just have to move up to the F word and drop that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some deficient writing, but I see it as independent of the cussing and so forth. I think that some of that's come from, people have remarked that for better or for worse, the Beats pretty much gave us like all of their shots. Whatever they had, they didn't hold it back. They put it out there. You decide if it's good or bad. But I think you see some things, happening. Some of it, Kerouac ultimately kind of retreated and lived with his mother and was drinking anywhere from 1/5 to 2/5 of alcohol a day. And that was affecting both his writing output and his writing quality. As you might imagine, it's affecting a lot of things.
His liver.
Allen Ginsberg, is writing for a very long time, and he gets more and more involved in so many causes and helping friends and so forth that I think his writing declined some. But at that point, he's kind of become a brand. I think it was the last 4 or 5 books. He jumped from City Lights to Macmillan, I think, and he's still popular, and people are still buying the work, and so there's sort of no sort of quality control in a sense. And I think that's some of those factors are more what led to some of the insufficient or deficient writing. Rather, I think it's independent of the language in some ways.
All right. Well, I was going to move into the sex, but we've talked a lot about sex tonight already. But
Still plenty of time left there.
We're
still
okay.
hankering for that. Okay. All right. In that case, literary sexual expression certainly existed before the Beats. Gustave Flaubert, with his flowery carnal attraction, undulated on the pages of Madame Bovary, while Henry Miller spilled raw eroticism in works such as The Rosy Crucifixion. How did the Beat authors further push the envelope? And we'll go back to Dr. Nesbitt on this one.
Well, I think you have really frank discussions of sex, and I think at a time when people aren't talking about sex, we don't have sex ed. My recollection, my understanding is from the time, you know, you even have like married couples portrayed as like sleeping in different beds and things like this, and there's just no discussion really of sex whatsoever. To see it mentioned in any sense, I think, is sort of shocking in some ways. I think then you have Burroughs talking about all sorts of, you know, sex with and among like intergalactic beings and such as this. You've got all that going on. You get, you know, Ginsberg talking about sex and talking very graphically about gay sex. So I think it's not just, I think the very subject of sex is sort of delicate and sensitive in those times, but then to talk about sex that is considered out there, gay sex, sex with aliens, gay sex with gay aliens, you know, people even now are still kind of like trying to process that and figure out what's going on there.
You say gay alien?
Yeah. As best I can tell, it gets a little tangled sometimes.
I think it was.
Do the gay aliens know that they're gay? That's the thing.
I think it was a definitively male sexuality, though, even in its homosexuality. I think it was definitively male. It was definitely from a man's perspective of sex and homosexuality. Even when, like I said, we talked about Diane DePrima, I thought she might have maybe started to lean into the feminine sexuality. But I mean, I would be hard pressed, I guess, and I even have a note to myself: a lack of her in the beats.
Very objectified in the relation.
Yeah.
We don't see the sexuality. Even in Flaubert, there's a sense that it's involved in relationships. And here, it's simply a natural act. And they're going to perform the natural act and then move on. It doesn't mean that they have a relationship with the person with whom they're having sex. And that was, in my growing up, the ultimate taboo. I mean, a lot of that has to do with being Irish Catholic, of course. But the ultimate taboo was, you know, having sex that had no interaction connected to it.
It always seemed too with me. I'm struggling to recollect, but it always seems like in Burroughs' case, there was always somebody who was unwilling.
Potentially. It was the gay alien.
It was the gay alien. He was just not, Burroughs was always into it.
No, I think that there's definitely that sense of the male gaze, Gaze, where you know there's this male viewing point of who's what, and if you go through, particularly again, Kerouac as somebody who you can go to a lot of his inner stories about what the good blonde and even the nomenclature, the things calling people dames and broads and dolls and these sort of terms that I guess you could say now, but are definitely a window dated in time. I don't know how many women like to be called broads anymore. Maybe they would do. I don't do that.
Why don't you try that?
Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm gonna stay with gay alien.
Right?
It's a safe bet because no one really knows if they're a gay alien or not. But dolls and that sort of thing, all of that terminology was seemingly okay. And there wasn't another term, so it wasn't as if they had something different. But there's definitely this heavily dominated male gaze viewpoint on the lens, on the whole perspective, for sure.
Well, that seems like a perfect segue to start talking about women in the beats. So while a beats completist might be familiar with the Prima, who we've discussed this evening, and Hetty Jones and Joyce Johnson, the average person might be surprised to learn that the Beats weren't a male-only club. Nevertheless, that begs the question, why don't the female beat authors enjoy the same acclaim? Was the work of these women simply not up to snuff? Patrick.
I don't want to say about how you're contributing to the, perpetuation of the patriarchy with that up to snuff comment, Daryl. I'm gonna let that one slide. But I definitely think that given the product of their times, we're talking that this still the late 50s, early 60s, it's still a predominantly male-driven society. Women are just entering the workplace. Rosie the Riveter was still a cultural shock. And so I think that it was just the social natural order of things, and that I think their involvement, and I think that we see a greater rise of feminism and the roles of female writers and artists in the hippie movement, and I think it's a direct result. I don't think you can have one without the other, and I certainly and definitely DePrima and Johnson, who I thought became greater voices long after they got out of the shadow of the beats and the beat writers. I thought they were definitely able to establish their own. If anything, I think the overwhelming maleness of the beats kind of kept the female voices down, and so it wasn't until after they were able to escape those shadows, and maybe even now. I certainly, in my original exposure to the beats back in the 1980s, didn't even consider the work of Hetty Jones until I got into grad school in the later 21st century, and so. I think because it was a boys' club, I really, and because essentially everything was at that point, if I'm not mistaken, and so. Right, that's a tremendous. You're right. That's exactly right.
Gay aliens, really.
You know?
We don't even know that,
Just
though.
saying.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a tremendous point. You know.
We did try to get some women on the panel, but their schedules didn't coordinate, so I was stuck with the 4 white guys. I'm sorry.
Sorry, white guy.
Right? I know, man. And my people are from Iceland.
I wonder how many women teach the beats. Because almost all the courses I come across are taught by men. And it was, I did not meet during that period any woman who was attempting to follow the whole beat culture, getting on the road, the hitchhiking, the traveling. I actually, a little bit later, read Lawrence Durrell, the British author who lived in Greece, and wrote this great series called the Alexandria Quartet. And a friend of mine and I hitchhiked to Egypt because we wanted to go to every place that he had been in. And we got there, and there were all these guys there who had read Durrell and wanted to be there, and only a couple of women who had come because they heard there were all these guys, American guys in Alexandria. But they weren't reading that. It really was a separate universe. Go back to McSorley's old ale house, which is just a phenomenal place with the worst beer imaginable. I do have to warn you. But in 1970, I think it was, there was a major uproar that roiled New York. It was headlines in every New York newspaper because they were trying to allow women to drink in McSorley's. And if you think of an issue like that coming up today, but McSorley's had been all male from its founding in the 19th century. And the schools, my college was all male. Every Jesuit school in America was all male. And they were demailed during that same period. So I think, and in the 50s, I'm trying to think of what women writers were considered important figures in the literary universe. We can go back and we can find some who were, and now we've done that. But I mean, it really was a guy's world.
Yeah, I'm gonna reference. I tell my mother and father, who are Peace Corps. They met in the Peace Corps in the '60s in Ethiopia. Actually, they met here, but they got married in Addis Ababa in 1967. And I remember saying, "Oh, the beat." I remember my mother going, "Meh," sort of like, not dismissive as much as it didn't do anything for her. Right? It was just, eh. Where my father was like, "Oh yeah," I mean, read it and knew it, and even maybe not touched him as much as it did for me many years later, but she definitely kind of gave the, that was a boys thing, and it's a male narrative that I didn't necessarily equate to, so to speak. She just kind of went, meh, Jack Kerouac,
My parents moved to Florida in 1970. They were 17 and 18 years old. They had their 1-year-old son in tow. He was me. And my biological father is not my father. He's just my dad, the guy who helped birth me. And so I'm a direct result of that. And I see him. He was the guy who introduced me to the Beats. And he said, Mom introduced me to Motown. And the music of Motown had a greater influence on her. And they were from Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia. So I would have thought, if anything, that they would have been caught some of that. Nope. Not, like I said, Dad, certainly as a high school kid and a young athlete, because of the revolution and And well, none of that gay stuff though. But then Mom, and even when I talked to her, she goes, oh, I wasn't really into the beats. When when I was telling her about this event, she was like, oh, that sounds kind of neat.
Neat, yeah.
Just kind of neat. And so, but if I told her, oh well, we're going to be talking about the music of Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson, and the Four Tops. It's a done deal. So I'm with you to that extent. I see that in my own personal history.
And for the young women in here, society really does change.
Yeah, right.
Things really do get better. And part of that change is homogenization and acceptance, so that we could not have had this conversation in the 50s in a college. That just would not have been accepted.
No.
And the issues we're talking about, we couldn't have talked about. And I don't think anybody in the 50s, I don't think there were very many faculty in 50s and even 60s who would assign any of the major Beats works. At least none that I can think of. But today, I bought for my grandson The Kinder Guide on the Road by Jack Kerouac.
Wow.
And it is about this wonderful voyage two young men have across America, and how they love music and they love making friends, and they have a wonderful time together.
Is there a chapter about popping speed? No?
No,
No, that's not
I mean,
there.
it reads like probably any of the books that my grandson gets to see.
Was it? Does that how you know? I would posit this question to the audience. Is this how you know the revolution is over if it becomes a children's book?
Or Saki, I'm gonna ask this then. So what book? And I'm thinking to myself, is it Erica Young? Is it Fear of Flying? That it's like the first sort of female sexualized, masterpiece, quote unquote, or that says, okay, I'm having sex and I'm having fun. Is that a seminal piece, you think, or what predates that says, okay, women are doing this and they're enjoying it? Meaning,
And that's the 60s. That's
right.
Yeah, once we get to the 60s, everything changes.
It's over, right? Okay.
Yeah. I've been going through the 50s in my mind, and I'm not
Right,
an
I can't-
Americanist.
Yeah.
I'm a British lit, 18th century Shakespeare person, and Florida lit. But I was trying to think of what in the 50s there
Right.
were.
I can't think of something
Yeah.
necessarily. The registry.
And I
I mean,
don't want to insult any of you by asking
do we
if you-
see Olds not until the 70s? Sharon Olds? And maybe what about Anne Sexton? Is that,
She was probably writing in the 60s.
Yeah, but even, I think because of geography and the culture of politics at the time, I think it was almost.
well, and then again, you got to look at the actual, commercial, saliency of it. I mean, who's going to sell this female author at this time, even if she's potentially good? And I hate to say it like that, but if there was no market, or no one's even going to give her that time, then it's not going to happen. That doesn't mean there probably wasn't somebody ripe and ready to be on stage for that. But,
And certainly we know that at the time, and in the area where they were in the Northeast, they were rock stars.
Right.
Because I'll bet you dollars to donuts. You do a session like this at a college in the Northeast, and 4 white guys are the last thing you'll see on the council. I mean, that's this we are by geography, and and so I think without a doubt that certainly played a role in it.
Well, it is 8:23, so with the last time we have left, I want to move to the third word in the poster, whether the beats remain relevant. In a piece in the New York Times, writer Lee Siegel revisited Ginsberg's poem, America. Quote, "When will you be worthy of your million Trotskyites?" he asked his fellow Americans in his poem. The Tea Party has an answer to that rhetorical question. The spirit of beat dissent is alive, though some may say not well, in the character of the Tea Party protest. Like the Beats, the Tea Partiers are driven by that maddeningly contradictory principle, subject to countless interpretations, at the heart of all American protest movements: individual freedom. The shared DNA of American dissent might be one answer to the question of why the Tea Partiers, so extreme and even anachronistic in their opposition to any type of government, exert such an astounding appeal, unquote. So here's the question. Do you see that connective tissue and shared DNA that Siegel suggests in his piece in the Tea Party? And that's the toss-up question for the panel.
Are we able to offend people on this?
Absolutely.
See, I don't see it as much in the Tea Party. I see the Tea Party as a reactionary movement.
Yeah, I would
a,
agree with
a
that.
return to the past. I do see it in Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is someone who has shattered every norm, and he's created an entirely new vocabulary for us. Does anyone remember last year talking about fake news? I mean, does anyone remember someone who has transformed the dialogue as radically, as quickly as he has? And Trump is certainly not a conservative force. He's invoking a lot of things in the past, but he wants a transformation that is, I think, very, very different in American society. I don't know what it is.
I don't think he does.
Maybe not.
I definitely think that these roots in anti-intellectualism, and I think that's the disseminating difference between. I agree that Trump is beat because he's upsetting the apple cart, and I think he has got some formal Northeastern education, regardless of how much he, remembers or retains, But when you are anti-intellectual, and I think that then you're getting away from the beat, and then you're just a rabble rouser. I was told when I was in high school, I went through that whole black trench coat phase, and I was an anarchist, and they're like, well, when you have anarchy, you got nothing. I mean, literally nothing. And so I think the beats were just striving for something different, whereas this generation of libertarian politics says, yeah, I want to blow up the whole thing. I always like to think that there was at least a positive, or at least hope for a positive outcome from blowing up the works with the Beats, and certainly with the hippies. They were hoping for something better. But yeah, with the Tea Party, I don't see the. Yeah, they did big time, and I think that we see that we're not seeing the positive outcome. We're just seeing we want the blow up. We still want all that, but we're not worried about what happens afterwards. And I think the popular thing with my generation, Generation X, is the first thing they do is to blame the baby boomers. Because you guys got to do it all. You got to be the Beats of the 1950s, and then you got to be the flower children of the 60s, and then you got to forsake all that and do all the cocaine and dance in the 70s. And then in the 80s, you got a little worried because you were getting old, so you had to start making some money. So you said, let me forget about all these other values, so I got to make some money. And now you've retired, and the Villages is blowing up, and it's turning right back into the 1950s and 60s all over again. So, yeah, on behalf of Generation X, I'm just going to say, fuck you guys.
He is a gay alien, by the way. He's officially our gay alien. If you want to know which one of us was. Yeah.
The bionic. The bionic.
Yeah, bionic. His right arm is made of titanium.
I mean, I think that one of the things too with the Beats, a lot of it was about human sensitivity, awareness of other people, respect and exploration, concern for the environment. So I see it as really relevant, but not connected to a lot of what's going on now politically. And I think one of the things too, someone said in the audience said a couple of minutes ago that the hippies lost. And Peter Coyote, who with the San Francisco Mine Troupe, was in the movie E.T. No gay stuff going on, just aliens in E.T. But he wrote a memoir called Sleeping Where I Fall, and talked about some of his experiences. And he said, talking about the hippies and such, he said that, like we didn't end the war, we didn't overthrow everything, we didn't revolutionize the system, and in that sense, we did fail. But he said, on the other hand, there are a lot of things that we were into that got really, really deeply injected into the culture. and that we hope are going to get injected into the politics. And he brought up things about, natural healing, women's rights, things that have been going on in terms of, racial desegregation, interest in Eastern religions, personal expression, and those sorts of things. So, maybe not all of the goals were accomplished by the Beats in the 50s and the hippies in the 60s and 70s. But I think a lot of good stuff happened, and we're still sort of seeing some positive effects from some of that. So I don't know. I don't know if I'd say that the hippies lost. I don't know if they won, but I think they certainly gained some ground and did some good things.
I had higher aspirations.
Well, you always want to have a high vision, always, no matter what happens. But I don't think it's been total defeat necessarily, either.
The Roots are the in-house band on The Late Show.
Yeah, right, there you go.
That's
That's
a
right.
great time to be in America.
Yeah. I would say, unfortunately, I mean, it's kind of a, in some ways, this hypothetical question of, if you had wings kind of scenario. I mean, how do you do it? The internet would have probably crushed the Beats of sort. Meaning, what gave the Beats such potency was the fact that it was a unique time, voice, and epic. And the internet, for all its greatness, is also limiting that or watering that down to the point of where, okay, sure, in other words, ask a young person today what they're watching, and they're like, oh, I got a favorite YouTuber, right? Which a lot of you are like, well, YouTuber, there's a favorite one, right? What does that mean? It means that reality TV would have co-opted the Beats and today on the road. I mean, it would have been some sort of competition. Who did more bennies? I did.
Right? Did not On the Road give us MTV's Road Rules?
Yes, I mean, right? No, literally road
Literally.
rules. I mean, and so I don't think you can say that it's going to be the same scenario, and yet I do think. There is still a place in everyone's time, maybe particularly men, and I hate to say that, but that's maybe the reality, for that window of time to hear this voice of, hey, wake up. Hey, wake up. There is a larger machine out there that's doing things, because before, now you're on your own, and, it's time to experience what that's about. Go out and do it. Whatever that is, hopefully something good. And in the end, it may be something good. So there's a window, but at 30, that window's sort of closed again. You look at it and you're like, really? That's a lot. You guys I'm tired. I'm going to bed by 9, right? But well, no, not now. I mean, but yeah, right. It's like we'll hang out later. It's the window of time for these people who really are they're awake. And it's important to be awake at some point in your life. Let's hope, and the Beats have that as a talisman for sure.
Yeah. And the window may be closing, but there's a longing there to
Yeah,
reopen it. And
right.
we see that in our students when we teach the courses. And I saw it when we founded the Kerouac House in College Park in Orlando, which is a residence for writers. And
Yeah.
when we first advertised it, it was remarkable
Thousands,
how many
right?
people.
Yeah. How many entries did you have? I mean, like.
Well, applying there, but I'm thinking,
Oh.
I'm a more practical guy.
Okay.
I'm thinking about the fundraising to buy the
Oh,
house.
okay. Right.
The people who were sending us checks because of their
Oh, right.
memories of it.
Sure.
And now it's available for anyone who would like to write. You spend 3 months in residence, and there is a stipend for meals. There's no cost there. There's a bicycle if you don't want to bring a car, and you can live there and just write to your heart's content for 3 months. It's actually 2.5, so they can clean it. And it's a wonderful operation. And also, if you go online looking at the Kerouac Project, Kerouac House in Orlando, they hold lots of activities. When the writer first comes, there's always some activity. Usually it's bring your own dish, meet the writer, and then at the very end, the writer does a reading and invites. These are open for anyone who'd be interested. And most of them are not very beatish. as writers. But it's an interesting idea, and you can just, I could see when we were collecting money, Bob Keeling was the prime mover and all that. Just people would write these really fascinating notes, along with their $100 check.
It's great. I'd actually invited Bob, but he had a conflict this evening, so he said he owes me for the next time. Ginsberg's poem Howl created quite the commotion when it was first published in 1956 from the legendary reading at Six Gallery in San Francisco, where Michael McClure asserted that it left them, quote, knowing at the deepest level that a barrier had been broken, that a human voice and body had been hurled against the harsh wall of America, unquote, to Lawrence Ferlinghetti's passionate advocating for the seminal work, earning him an obscenity charge in 1957. Brett, if you wouldn't mind, let's listen a bit to Ginsberg reciting his poem.
Starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night, who, poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high, sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz, who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs, illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant, cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake-like tragedy among the scholars of war, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, who cowered in unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in wastebaskets and listening to the terror through the wall, who got busted in their pubic beards returning through Laredo with a belt of marijuana for New York, who ate fire and paint hotels or drank turpentine in Paradise Alley death, or purgatoried their torsos night after night with dreams, with drugs, with waking nightmares, alcohol and cock and endless balls, incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and lightning in the mind leaping toward poles of Canada and Patterson, illuminating all the motionless world of time between peyote solidities of halls, backyard green trees, cemetery dawns, wine drunkenness over the rooftops, storefront boroughs of tea-head, joyride, neon, blinking traffic light, sun and moon and tree vibrations in the roaring winter dusks of Brooklyn, ashcan rantings and cut.
All right, that was a bit of Howl. Gentlemen, is Howl still relevant in 2017? And I'll go to Dr. Nesbitt first on this.
Definitely so. Definitely. I think in terms of the poetic images, it's still relevant, it still resonates. I think in some of the discussions in the poem about sort of the horrific conditions that people are kind of going through, because the poem is basically divided into three parts. And in the first part, Ginsberg talks about his friends, the people who have sort of been destroyed by madness, and goes through kind of this personal catalog of people and so forth. And then in the second part, he begins to discuss the reasons for that, and he personifies that as Moloch, who was a Canaanite fire god who demanded child sacrifice. And he sees Moloch as things like money, the military-industrial complex, the government, anything that's kind of oppressive or sort of a tyrannic regime. And then in the third section, he sort of imagines himself reuniting with his friend Carl Solomon and sort of coming back together with him. So I think that the conditions he talks about are still relevant, that we still have these sort of, we know people in our lives who have been destroyed by things, who are battling against difficult things. Everyone is battling or struggling with something difficult. Absolutely everyone is. and sort of trying to understand the reasons for this, and then I think realizing that it's only by, I think, awareness, sensitivity, trying to bond and rely on one another, the human element, that we can sort of withstand and overcome these things. And I think that message is just as relevant now as it was the day that Ginsberg wrote it.
But I think, even though I believe, I think it articulated beautifully, in order to reach the next generation, one of the next generation who is here is going to have to take it and turn it into a video and use that to actually bring in the images that will carry the words, because we have a new generation that I don't think is going to be as comfortable simply listening to
Just
it,
seeing it on the
reading
page.
it, seeing it on the
Yeah.
page. So I think we need to, just as we reinvent Shakespeare's plays in film, in new theatrical interpretations, I think it's time to start reinventing some of these works.
Do you think that the Howe film that came out with Franco a couple years ago does that, or does it need to be done by a really, really young, fresh, like, a couple of 20-year-olds in their garage doing it?
Someone back there is nodding, yes, it doesn't. What?
I would say Franco represents this new generation of beats. I really like what he's trying to do with cinema and literature. As I Lay Dying is phenomenal. I thought he did a great job with it. And so I think it's really, I think it's interesting that his name would come up, and especially, and I think that the beats taught us that before the beats there was polite society and then criminals, and that was it. You were either part of polite society or you were a criminal. And then the Beats introduced this idea too, well, there's polite society, there's the rest of us, and then there's the criminals. And I think we have somewhere along the lines where we've fallen back into this mode of there's polite society and then there's the criminals. And I think we need to get back to that. There's polite society, the rest of us, and then there are actual criminals. And I think the Beats were the first. The hippies ran away with it and said, no, there's not even polite society. There's just the rest of us. But I think you do have to realize that. I think we're almost due for maybe another generation of Beats. And maybe that young person that turns Howl into a 2.5-minute YouTube video will be the one that shakes things up.
Yeah, and I think it has to represent further characters from the margins. I teach on West Campus in Orlando, which is Kirkman, Pine Hills, primarily a community. The students who are in my class are they're the ones who've made it out of Evans, Oak Ridge, Jones, and some of the toughest schools in Orlando. And if I give them, which I have, I've played Howl, and it's lost on them in many ways because it's not in their linguistic parameter. However, if you want to see, a current dialogue, go watch Get Out, which is in the theaters right now, and it's a scary movie, but not scary movie unless you're a white guy. No, the reality is the linguistic parameter for these people can no longer be. Like myself, a liberal Jew from New York, right? We kind of know that language, and that meaning we know it's expected. We need the unexpected voice currently. So not to disparage what Howl means or meant, because I think it's super important. But the new Howl has to have that technological world. In other words, I'm not writing on chalkboards. Chalkboards, everybody, they don't exist anymore. And even whiteboards, they're smart boards now. And there's going to be something new in the next, whatever. And that's okay. You have to be okay with what that language is, but it must be spoken in that language. Otherwise, it's going to be lost, I feel.
Let me add, I have the last chalkboard at Rollins.
Do you really?
In my classroom. My department is
All right, sorry, Saki has
anxiously waiting for me to retire so they can rip it down and
Yeah.
put the smartboard
Yeah.
in. But what I've never found on whiteboards or smartboards is how you can get that screech.
Oh, yeah, no, you can't.
Wake students
Yes,
up.
it does not. Yeah. Oh.
Let's pivot to Burroughs for a moment. In The Naked Lunch, he focuses the reader's eyes on the carefully shaded underbelly of capitalism. Given that at least one author argues that, like his book suggests, today the lunatics and perverts don't just dine at the same table as the rich and powerful, like the pigs and the men in Animal Farm did. They are one and the same. Did America miss Burroughs' point, looking at our current state of affairs?
Can there be a one-word answer?
Make it the lightning round. Go ahead.
Yes.
I think a lot of people are still trying to kind of get Burroughs' point, honestly. You know, 'cause I think with Burroughs, you know, Naked Lunch is something I think it's talked about. It's kind of like Finnegan's Wake or Ulysses. It's talked about more than it's read. And if you've ever read it, if it can be read, if you've ever processed it, you know, then you completely understand, you know, sort of why. And you know, that's good in some ways. Is I don't ever feel I have to worry about Burroughs standing over me telling me what I must think, making it, you know, so crystal clear that there's no other way to think about it. But I think in some ways, and I think also he produced a lot of work that wasn't particularly well read, or people still don't know what to do with him. He still makes people. I think it's probably the beat that makes people the most uncomfortable. I would kind of argue.
Yes.
And some of his stuff is also very abstract. You know, in my class, we read and listen to this really short piece called "The Man Who Taught His Asshole to Talk," and it's kind of a metaphor because in the vignette, the routine, it's about a guy who slowly becomes overtaken by his anus and is completely encased in it, and so forth, and it's very interesting, but I worry sometimes that people just kind of get absorbed with the shock value of it and don't think about it as it's a metaphor for being overtaken by sometimes more base things. Or as I tell the students, have you ever met someone, you know, you think is an asshole? Like this person literally sort of becomes that. So I think a lot of people have missed the point, and I think it's pretty understandable because he's, I think, really hard to get.
Philip K. Dick wrote a short story called "I Have No Mouth, Therefore I Have No Mouth, But I Want to Scream," which is comparable, and it's a similar evolution. It's a series of people, and they are all killed off, but it's all by these super intelligent supercomputers that do this to human beings. And so I think the neatest thing about Burroughs was that he made us look interior and say, all this suffering and all these horrible things, they aren't because of the exterior world, they're because they exist in us as is. And that, you know, that there are horrible people in the world and they contain horrible things, and that's just the way it is. And this idea that some notion, oh no, it's these exterior forces that are affecting us. No, some people are just horrible. And that's just the way it is. And I think Burroughs was the first, if not the only writers out of those to realize that some of us are just horrible people.
I feel too sometimes in his work that he wasn't really trying to explain why some things are the way they are. He was just showing it. He wasn't necessarily trying to make sense of it. And maybe there's a feeling that you can't make sense of it, and so he didn't even attempt. So, you know, reading Burroughs looking for, I think, sort of enlightenment or understanding or a guide about what to do, it's not really in there. It doesn't mean it's not bad writing, but it's just not. It's more explorative, maybe in some ways, than it is kind of, you know, giving us answers.
Yeah, and that's reticent of postmodern literature in so many ways too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm thinking of Cloud Atlas. If you try and read that, anybody try to read that on purpose? No, I mean, my friend was like, "You'll love this," and I was like, "No, I no longer like my friend." It's an interesting, you know, piece, or actually anything that's seemingly postmodern. It's a lot to deal with because it's often not your story, and it's often, again, this pluralistic world of, you know, what am I doing? And we try and compartmentalize so much of it, but it's a difficult road because we're not living inside the Burroughs-esque mind, nor do I want to.
Right.
And yet I do think we take pleasure in ultimately, you know, examining that and letting that postmodern play with us, and having, copies of copies of copies of copies, this Warhol sort of, pop universe of something watered down, and no longer, we think we own it, but we just own a copy of it, where it's not ours to really maintain. So it's an interesting place, but I struggle with the comprehension, and maybe that's on purpose too.
Yeah.
I definitely think that whole stream of consciousness helps set the table for my man Hunter S. without a doubt.
Sure.
Because I like to think that you are a Burroughs expert if you have read The Naked Lunch from beginning to end. In that same respect, that if you have read Fear and Loathing from beginning to end, then you are an expert on that. Because how many of us have read any of these books that we talk about from beginning to end? Much less tried to wrap our heads around them, but just actually tackle the tome in and of itself. And so that says something about all of us that we might not want to hear.
And it also says something about those writers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have a closing question, but I'm not going to ask it right now. As I said from the beginning, I'd love to hear from you. So instead of going to get the cards, if you have a question that you want to test the fortitude of our panel, please just stand up and ask a question. Sir, I saw your hand go up first.
Would the Beats movement of the late 50s, early 60s have made it without Grove Publishing and Barney Rossett? Would have they been able to take off the way they did?
I think the answer is no, unless someone else had emerged in that way, the same way that Ulysses never would have been published except for Sylvia Beach and her bookstore in Paris, Shakespeare and Company. I mean, there's that inevitable connection that has to arise, has to emerge. Nowadays, it becomes really hard because of the internet and the problem with publication and the difficulty. My son's up in Nashville, and we have a lot of friends in the music industry there, and they aren't signing young singers because the young singers are going on YouTube and releasing albums, and only when someone becomes famous do they sign them. So young promising singers don't exist. I think the same thing is true with writers. It's a nightmare for young writers right now to be heard, and the ones that academics talk about, I'm not sure anybody else reads.
Right?
But,
Yeah.
but then we had a limited number of publishing houses, and something like Grove Press comes along and is able to break it through people's consciousness.
Sir.
I have one question, just to get your perspective on it. So conservatism has taken a hold of the government for the next 4 years at least, for the Trump presidency. However, history does repeat itself type of thing, and there was times back in the past, even with vocabulary, where we did hear like fake news, such as Lufthansa in Germany and stuff like that. And my main question to you guys is, do you believe there is another Beats movement on the rise with the self-starters of the YouTube generation and the new genres of music that are coming out and the new connection that at least the youth culture is having with like fellow African Americans, women, and all their rights? So my main question is, do you believe that there's going to be another Beats movement? Or currently it's just going to be a liberal movement, because the Beats movement was more liberal, but not all liberal movements are the Beats.
I'll help address that. I think it's got to be more and more, unfortunately, the money power players, the world of Netflix and Amazon and those internet players taking risks on people, like the show on HBO, Insecure, okay, about a black female and black female issues. In other words, spreading out that proverbial color palette for everybody to have a voice, and yet there's a danger there, and that if everyone has a voice, then who's listening, right? I mean, ask somebody now, what are you watching? And they're like, oh, well, I kind of watch this, and then it fades off. Where, our television sort of narrative of, let's say, the 1970s, we had 4 options. We all had a more similar Jungian story. We could all go, oh, I saw MASH, we related to that character because there was only so many options. So, is there a new beat movement coming? The answer is probably yes, but it's very hard to say it's definitively beat, right? And where can it be from? I mean, and I say definitively yes, and then I'm going to say no. I'm going to say no in that,
Very postmodern. of
right?
you.
Yeah, it is. No, and I hate to
beat,
say it.
man.
I know, it's very, very postmodern. Yes, there's the beat ideology, but no, it can't be delivered in the same methodology. It's gotta, and again, if someone had said to me, let's say 5-10 years ago, oh, YouTube's going to be as big as it is, there'll be YouTube stars making, Cash Me Outside. How about that? All right. I mean, what? I mean, the fact that this girl has made $1 million off of a ridiculous phrase in some sort of Maury Povich outing. I'm like, wait, what? I mean, it asks me, do I just start saying random things to see if someone's, catching me on my phone? There's got to be something new. I don't think we're there yet, and maybe the Trumpism universe is going to push artists into that realm. The '80s certainly, against Reagan, a variety of bands, and I'm thinking music specifically, did speak to that voice. It's hard to know. I don't know. Someone else may want to.
I think we're going to see something. I don't know if it's going to be specifically beat, but I think that with the Beats were not the first people to get together and say, wow, this kind of sucks, I want to do things differently. I think that the Beats are more or less kind of the latest manifestation of kind of a recurring historical and aesthetic tendency. You've got the Transcendentalists, the Harlem Renaissance, the Romantics, the Decadents, all groups and movements and people that came before them.
Yep.
So something will come again, and my guess is I think you may start to see something interesting happening in Detroit. And the reason I say Detroit is you see a lot of these movements come up where people are unhappy with the conditions, and also where it's really cheap to live for artists and writers and things like that. And that sounds like an unexpected place. But you think, for example, there was a time when New York wasn't sort of this huge cosmopolitan center of art and so forth, and so I think that might be a likely place. But something will happen, and it may completely bypass YouTube and all of that. But I do agree, it may be something that's going to be different in terms of the medium from what we've seen before. But help is on the way.
And if you've been following the news about Detroit, and I love that mention of it, you can buy a 4-bedroom house in Detroit for $200, which is why so many young people are going there. But then, of course, you have to live in Detroit.
Yeah.
And even worse, you have to leave
Find a
Florida
job.
for it. Okay, my answer would be, given our fragmentary culture and fragmented culture, I suspect there'll be a lot of Beats movements because none of you share your playlist. You all have your own playlist. So each of you is going to have your own beat movement. I think we've lost the unified culture, except for one that is so dumbed down and homogenized that we see on generally those 4 channels that we used to watch way back in the day, the sitcoms. We're just not, I'm not sure we will ever regain that. We'll ever have something like that. But then if we look back at that time, how many people actually read Kerouac? There were many of us who thought we were rebels, but none of the other kids I knew in Jersey City were reading Kerouac.
I think it's generational. I think each generation has its beats. And I think the beats that we talked to, those were Saki's beats. I mean, granted, they were ours too because we had a bunch. But I mean, they were the beats of many of you that were here. But they weren't mine as a Gen Xer, But they're certainly not you guys as millennials and post millennials. I mean, so I think every generation has its what you would call beats, and that's why I argue more that they are a collective as more opposed to a movement. And I would point to Dave Chappelle's Block Party, one of the best concert videos ever made. And you look at Dave Chappelle, you look at where he lives, and I won't spoil too much for you, but you will be shocked at the community he lives in. And you see he decides that he's going to put on this concert in Brooklyn, and it's going to be free. And he's going to bust people in, and all these artists are huge artists in the underground hip-hop community. I'm talking about Dead Presidents, Erykah Badu, Jill Scott, The Roots, and you guys are like, who the F? Right? Kanye West comes in with a high school marching band. I mean, that's what and so for me, that group, that collective, Chappelle and those musicians and those writers that hung out with him at that time, to me, those are the beats for my generation. You know, those are my beats. And I find it either humorous or ironic that they are all African American. And so, you know, and I include myself in them. You know, I am beats with them. You know, and so I think it's a generation. So I think you've got Tupac. Is PewDiePie maybe one of the beats for your generation? You know, I mean. All right, do you guys even know? So I'm still trying to wrap my head about these people who watch other people play video games. Right? But that's beats. So find your own. Like Saki said, you will have your own. And it may be each and one of you individually.
Great. Any other questions? Well, because of the hour, I'm going to abridge and not ask the final question because this one could get us talking all night. So with that, I'm going to thank you all for coming to our inaugural Beacon Salon. And I want to thank the panel for an entertaining, intellectual, and compelling discussion.
We would like to thank Daryl for organizing this and putting it on. And I think you can see from the way he framed his questions that we were having trouble figuring out that he was a very successful journalist and columnist, because then we could stop and actually read prose.
Thank you, Saki. Well, and I guess my parting shot is, as I preface the discussion this evening, this is the first of these beat salons, and I hope if you enjoyed yourself this evening, you'll keep your eye out for the next one and tell your friends and come and enjoy another invigorating discussion. Thank you very much for coming. Have a safe ride home. But thank you for coming, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.